Hey everyone, glad you could be here. We're going to get started in just a moment, give folks a chance to trickle in. So thanks for making the time.
Thanks for arranging this, David. David, can you hear me?
Yes, John.
Great. So it would be awesome for you to introduce our speaker because his background is so impressive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
We'll get going in just a moment. I know we've got just an hour, so we want to take advantage of the time. So let me actually just kind of jump in. Morning, everyone, or afternoon, or good evening, depending on kind of where you are. My name is David Kutosh, and I work with John Min on this initial engagement in the Monex kind of Darden executive education endeavor. This is a first of a set of 3 virtual sessions with esteemed faculty from Darden, with Dan Murphy, who's in our global economics and markets group. I've worked with Dan on a couple of other programs, and John, I won't throw you under the bus distinctly, but I would say an economist who can kind of simplify concepts so that I can understand is a cherished thing. And so Dan's established abilities, at Notre Dame and Michigan, both pursuing both undergraduate and graduate level work. But also just his ability to kind of prioritize the learner. You'll hear a couple different kind of questions from Dan as we endeavor to understand kind of precisely how this session can hit the mark with Monex. But just grateful for not only the time with you all, but with Dan to really kind of get this going and in the right direction. Olivia, would you care to jump in there as well?
Just that I'm a program manager here on the Darden side. So if you guys experience any technical difficulties, please feel free to message me. We do ask that you put your cameras on, mute yourselves unless you are talking. And then if you don't, or if you are familiar with the hand raise button, please feel free to use that as we get into discussions.
Okay, move it.
All right, should we get started? Thank you guys for that introduction. They'll decide whether or not I have anything to convey to them about the macroeconomy after this hour. So we'll see where we get. But what we're going to do over the next hour is just have a discussion about what drives the macroeconomy, what sort of institutions we have that help try and keep the macroeconomy on track, and then we're going to look forward and think about the potential effect of tariffs and other kind of global economic events within the lens of that framework. Before we get started, how many of you have taken macroeconomics before? Quick show of hands. Okay, decent number of you. How many of you were glad you took macroeconomics? How many of you wish you had not taken economics at all? All right, so you all liked it. All right, that's rare. All right, we've got some macroeconomists here. All right, so you can help us along. This is going to be kind of interactive. So as we go along, use the raise hand sign and you'll jump to the top of the screen. Before we get started, did you guys see the material, the case that was circulated beforehand? Did you have a chance to read that? No, you didn't? Okay, that's fine. That won't matter so much. We'll just kind of talk briefly about some of the concepts covered there. Now, let's suppose that you have to choose at the beginning of time whether you're going to live in an economy where real GDP grows like this, or whether it grows like this. Which would you prefer? And before you answer that, what is real GDP? How should we think about real GDP? Any preference? If you have no preferences, you're going to be randomly assigned to one of these economies and you'll be stuck there forever. What would you prefer? All right, so since I don't have any volunteers to say what real GDP is, I'll just say it myself. So we can think about real GDP as the total market value of everything we produce, say within a year, within the United States. Now, all else equal, do we want to live in a country that's producing more or less? And why? If I don't see a hand, I'm going to have to
theoretically more.
Okay, there we go, Mark. Theoretically more. Why is that?
Usually a high GDP or a good GDP is a barometer of how your country is doing. So obviously there's more factors to it, but in all things considered, you would want a higher GDP.
Yeah. Now, there are caveats to this, as Mark mentioned, but all else equal, if you can produce more stuff, there's more stuff for you to consume, and that might lead to a better quality of life. We'd probably rather live in the US today than we would, say, 300 years ago. Real GDP is higher. We'd probably rather live in a country with high GDP per capita than a country with low GDP per capita. Okay, so that's GDP. Do you guys want to be on a roller coaster or the flat line? If we were to kind of choose right now what economy we'd live in, which one would you prefer? Real GDP is going to grow, but it's either going to grow in a more stable way, the blue line, or a bit of a roller coaster. You get to decide at the beginning of your time, and that's the economy you're going to live in. Fesh?
Flat.
You'd probably want to go for the one that's just a linear line. It's a lot more stable
Okay, and why do you want that? Why do you want the linear line?
because then it's like more predictable and you're not dealing with like unemployment or something like that or the negative effects of the downturns or the stagnation.
Okay. What do you guys think? Do you agree with Fesh? Does he speak for everybody at Monex?
Yep.
Not me.
Not me. Who said not me?
Me
Matt.
neither.
I mean, I prefer the ups and downs.
Yeah, why is that? You like a roller coaster?
I do. I mean, continued growth to me just seems like a bizarre concept that we try to uphold. And there's going to be ebbs and flows in anything you do in life. And I would just assume that that's a little bit better in order to take focus on what it is that is actually occurring and then move forward from there. Like build and destroy in my mind.
I agree with Matt too.
So, who was that? Ahmed?
Peter, sorry.
Okay.
I agree too. I think you need to have some pressure relieving valves that go in place. As long as consistently 2 or 3%, it's okay. You don't want to have huge swings. A steady growth doesn't seem feasible to me.
Oh, but there's a hypothetical. You get to choose. I'm letting you choose. I'm asking you your preferences.
I mean,
not what you think is feasible.
I would still say I like to have ups and downs because then there's buying opportunities.
Okay, so if you're able to kind of time the market, or you're kind of able to take advantage of the roller coaster, you might like it. Now,
I
let's
would
say
say
you're
the
average
linear
American.
provides more certainty, right? So it's more interesting for investors from foreign countries.
Sure, if you're an investor, you might like the swings. What if you're the average American? Let's say you're not, working on investing. You just earn your income and you go to the grocery store, you provide food for your family. Which one would you prefer if that's your scenario?
Straight line.
Straight line? More predictable income, more predictable job?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Much more stable.
What happens at the trough here? So if we go back to the roller coaster, what happens at the bottom? What's going on here? Is this good or bad? What's the macroeconomy look like?
What do you mean?
I guess the acceleration rate is a lot sharper.
Okay. And what does that mean for the average household? And let's see some hands. I know I've got 100 people here, so do you use your electronic hand. You'll come to the top of my screen and we'll call on you. And then if no one raises their hand, then I'll start cold calling people. If you were to read that the U.S. economy is starting to slow down like this, what would you predict? What kind of things might we expect to see in the data, or what would be some of the experiences of average households? Daniel?
Higher debt per household.
Possibly. That might be at least debt to income, because incomes would be slowing down and potentially even falling. So that's one thing. What else? Shyam?
Recession risk.
Okay, and what's so bad about a recession?
Unemployment typically increases and ramps up, and inflation potentially is increasing as well.
I agree with you that this represents a recession and that unemployment tends to be high. Would you guys agree? When the economy starts to slow down, we tend to have higher unemployment. Inflation, not necessarily. It kind of depends. On average, when we hit a trough like this, we don't tend to see inflation spike. So this is one of the downsides of the bottom of the roller coaster. What about up here? Is this all good times? Are we all happy? What's going on as we start to, hit the boom? Jamin? I think you're on mute.
Prices go up.
Okay, that's right. Here we tend to see inflation. John?
Your interest rates?
So now we'll talk soon about what's happening to interest rates. They tend to be
Okay.
responding to whether we're at the top or the bottom of the roller coaster. Rowena?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. What would be happening with house prices?
That's also a good question. It depends on many things. They'll tend to be higher up here. As we get to the top of the roller coaster, people have more incomes, they feel richer, they start to buy more homes, and they bid up the price of homes. Now we heard inflation, that also tends, they're buying lots of things, right? Their incomes are high, they start to spend a lot, and that's where we get the inflation, both in goods prices, but also in home prices. If you're a homeowner, maybe not such a bad thing. If you're a renter, it might not be great. I see P. Peace, I don't know your name. I don't know how to say your last name.
Peaced out, sorry.
All right, peaced out. There we go.
I would say over exuberance, and which could risk the market crashing eventually.
Yeah, and that might be an explanation for how we get here, right? People feel like they're rich, they spend a lot, and that's what drives us up the roller coaster. Okay, so these are some of the downsides of both the trough and the peak of the roller coaster. Now, as we heard, at the same time, there are some advantages to the roller coaster. If you're in the markets, you can maybe take advantage of the ups and downs. But on average, for the average American, at the trough, they might be unemployed. At the peak, they're facing inflation. Now, it turns out in the United States, we've decided that we'd like our institutions to help keep this on this blue straight line. Do they do it perfectly? No. But at least we attempt to do that. Who's in charge? Who's the primary institution responsible for keeping us on the blue line, to making sure we don't have such big peaks and troughs? Does anyone know? Daniel?
Would you say it'd be the Fed?
You bet. So that's kind of our central bank. Now, the Federal Reserve has two primary objectives. We'll talk about in a moment about how they achieve those objectives, but does anyone know what the target they're trying to hit is? What are their kind of explicit objectives? Helen? I think you're on mute, Helen.
Steady and keeping employment steady, prices and employment.
You bet. So we can kind of loosely think about it as low unemployment and low stable inflation. Are those things you guys like? Would you like to live in an economy with low unemployment and low stable inflation? Okay, I see some nodding heads. So that suggests that you guys kind of agree that we'd like to achieve these things. We've chosen the Federal Reserve to be the institution that's in charge of trying to help us achieve these. How should we think about these objectives in relation to our initial little graph here? How do these objectives here relate to the initial part of our discussion? How should we interpret them? I saw half a hand from John. He went like this, so at least I could see you on my screen, John. There you go. Floor's yours. You want to take a stab at it, John Green, or anyone else?
Can you just say the question one more time?
Yeah. How do we interpret these two objectives relative to this chart that we've just been working with? Our little picture here. Carson?
So low unemployment would be at usually our peaks, but low inflation would be at our troughs. So it's kind of the embodiment of staying in between those two states, at least how I take it.
That's exactly right. So we should interpret this as staying on the blue line. Very good. Now, how is it that the Federal Reserve keeps us on that blue line or tries to keep us on that blue line? Let's suppose that we find ourselves at a trough in a recession. So we find ourselves down here. What is it the Federal Reserve does, and how does that get us back up to the blue line? Katie?
Lower interest rates.
Okay. Katie, is that what you're going to say?
That is what I was going to say, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Usually down here, they would lower interest rates. Why is that? Why would lower interest rates help us get back to the blue line?
Increase investments and growth. More into equities than fixed incomes and stuff.
Okay, Jake, I agree with that. Katie, what do you think? Do you agree?
Consumer spending?
You bet. All right, so you guys are telling me a story that when interest rates go down, consumer spending, whether by firms or by households, tends to go up. Is that correct? Does that make intuitive sense? If interest rates go down, why might you spend as a household more when interest rates go down? What might you spend more on?
You'll spend more, borrow more, buy stuff you can't afford otherwise.
Yeah. Could be a car, could be some furniture, you name it.
Also savings.
Well, you're going to save less is basically what, as interest rates go down, saving is less valuable. You get less return for that. And so we tend to see that as interest rates go down, spending goes up. So when we're at the trough down here, we'd want to lower interest rates and get spending back up. How does the Fed lower interest rates? Does anyone know? Do they say if you trade at an interest rate that's, different from what we want, you're going to jail? And they round people up and put them in jail if they don't hit their target interest rate? Fesh, what do you think?
I believe they changed the overnight lending rate that they provide to banks.
That's one option. They don't tend to do that too much because banks don't always want to have to go to the Fed for borrowing. They tend to want to just go to each other. It's a bad signal if banks have to approach the Fed.
Change in money supply.
Wonderful. Laios, is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say more open market operations.
Yep. We can think about those as the same thing. In other words, they effectively print more money. What do you think that's going to happen to the price? Let's call the interest rate the price of money. What's going to happen to the price of money if you put more money into the market?
Value goes down.
Yeah.
Inflation
Interest rate's going to go down. If I'm looking to borrow money and there's no money out in the market, I'm going to have to pay a really high interest rate. But if all of a sudden there's more money out there, it's easier for me to get a hold of it. That price is going to drop and then I can get a lower interest rate. So that's sort of the tool they use, is they inject more money into the market, and that's what brings prices down or brings interest rates down. Now we're covering about a semester's worth of macroeconomics in an hour, so slow me down if there are questions. We're either shy or you have no questions. Mr. Malone.
I understand what you're saying and it makes sense, but so just in terms of the reality of the consumer here, the bulk of the people in the country aren't making investments. I'm thinking you're talking about day-to-day habits on purchasing groceries or whatever it is they're buying. How does this lead to them actually increasing their spending?
That's a good question. So there are two ways it could do it. One is you might be more likely to buy a car if the interest rate you pay on that loan is lower, right? So then you buy more cars. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but cars are something you need. I mean, who's just going out and buying a new car for the sake of it just because rates are a little bit lower? To me, that just seems weird.
Well, I'll just be a little bit personal here. I'm still driving a 15-year-old Prius. I have a car I need, but I wouldn't mind a better car that doesn't break down as much. And if interest rates were lower, I might go upgrade my car and buy a nicer car, for example. But the other way this happens is when interest rates go down, who else spends in the economy? It's not just households. Who else does a lot of spending? Companies, right? They build new factories. They build new machines. They build new buildings. Those capital expenditures are very interest rate sensitive. All else equal, when interest rates go down, it's a lot cheaper to build that next factory.
Yeah, and Spanish as well. Yeah.
And so when interest rates go down, businesses build more buildings, they build more factories, They need to hire people to do that. That gives people more income, and then they go spend more on groceries. So, Mr. Malone, to your question, so how does it influence households? Oftentimes, they're hired more when companies hire construction workers to go and build that next factory. Then those construction workers have more money. They go out to eat more, and so on and so forth. So this whole relationship, interest rates going down, spending going up, there's a lot embodied in that. It's both households directly spending, it's also firms spending more and hiring more people, and as people are hired more, they start to spend more. Are we okay with that relationship between lower interest rates and more spending? Okay.
I'm not.
You're not, Marcin, okay? What's wrong?
Because how about 2008, 2009 post crisis, interest rates went down.
We're going to get there. Keep that question in mind, and by the end of the hour, we should answer that. One thing to keep in mind is this relationship is drawn holding all else equal. Right? So think about holding all else equal in the macroeconomy. If interest rates go down, we're going to get more spending. And it turns out that total spending in the economy is the same as GDP. So when interest rates go down, all else equal, we get more GDP. Now, Marcin, to your question, in 2008, not all else was equal. But all else equal, the central bank says whatever's going on, if we're in a recession, we can lower rates, and that should increase spending. Now, this looks pretty good, right? Do we want more spending and more GDP in the economy, typically? Well, if that's the case, if you're the central bank, why not, lower this to the tilt and really jack up spending? In other words, if you're advising the central bank, would you say, hey, let's keep interest rates super low?
A little
Mark?
straight line.
Mark Hill?
Yes and no. It's an even balance. How
Okay,
do you
how so?
achieve both? You don't want to over lower and increase the money supply where you set off enormous spending, but you don't want the opposite either.
Why not? What's wrong with enormous spending? We're all living like kings. We're all going on cruises and out to eat and all kinds of fun stuff. What's wrong with that?
Massive inflation. Everything's going to get more and more expensive.
So it's not just that Mark doesn't want people to have fun. It's more that he's worried that as spending goes up, you might start to see too much inflation. Would you guys agree?
Yep.
We can think about the point at which we start to get inflation as being driven by what we're going to call the full employment line of output, level of output. So this is why full employment. This is a conceptual level of GDP that represents how much the economy can produce if we're all working a typical work week and we're all fully utilizing our machines and not overworking them. Does that make sense? Have you guys ever worked at a factory or a business where you haven't fully utilized your capital, where it's been sitting idle? Have you ever been in a barber shop where you could give a lot more haircuts, but there aren't many people coming in? That would be like GDP being below YFE. That would be a recession. That would be too much slack in the economy. Have you ever felt like you were working so hard, you're just overworked? You're working more than 40 hours a week and you're just grinding. If you're in a factory, you're overutilizing your machines. You're trying to meet these customers' orders and you're working your butt off. I see like one nodding head. It seems like you guys have nice lives at Monex. That's not happening to you. So that's pleasant. But in any case, in principle, this can happen. Where you're being overworked, you're working your butts off. That's like producing beyond YFE. And if on average the whole economy is producing past YFE, that means we're working overtime, we're overutilizing our machines so they're breaking down, we're having to fix them more. And that's going to increase prices for companies. It increases their costs. They have to pay overtime. They have to pay more to fix these machines that are working overtime. And that's going to lead to higher inflation. So over here, we get inflation. Down here, we get unemployment. Are we okay with that? So what's the sweet spot for the economy? If you were to set the level of interest rates, let's say you're the central bank and you could perfectly influence interest rates, where would you want them to be? Where would you set the level of interest rates?
Around 2%.
Okay. Let's suppose the 2% was here. Would you still want 2%? I'm not asking about today, like this moment. I'm saying like conceptually. Enrique, I saw a physical hand, not a virtual one, but I'll.
Yeah, sorry, it was a fly around me. But the rate should be in the place that gets close to full employment. That's
You bet. So we can just go up from full employment and say the rate
yeah.
that would give us spending consistent with full employment is this. Maybe it's 1%. That's exactly right. So if you're the central bank, you want to influence interest rates to be at about 1%. 1% will lead to spending that kind of puts us right on this blue line. You can think about YFE as a snapshot of the blue line over here. Right? So we're just kind of taking a cross section, a snapshot there. In other words, at an interest rate of 1%, the way we've drawn things, the economy is perfectly balanced. We're spending just as much as we're able to sustainably produce. Peaced out, are we okay with that?
Yeah, I was gonna say that I'm wondering, I always thought it had to be at the pace of growth. And you wanted, am I off on that or?
No, you're right. Turns out this is YFE this year, but it tends to grow year over year. This YFE that I've drawn here is a snapshot like this. Next year, it'll be up here. And so this YFE is growing year over year. We'd have to draw a new graph for next year.
Okay.
But this year, or this quarter, if this is where YFE is, this is where the central bank wants spending to be. Okay, now let's say that we wake up tomorrow and home prices have plummeted by 50%. Your home values have dropped massively. How might that influence your spending behavior? John.
You probably feel less wealthy and you'll spend less.
You bet. So all else equal, this spending line is shifting in. For any given level of interest rates, if interest rates are at 1%, we used to be spending here. Now our spending has shifted all the way over here. Now we're in the recession zone, right? Now our spending for an interest rate of 1% has massive unemployment. Agreed? If you're the central bank, what do you want to do with interest rates? Helen?
Or like dramatically.
Yeah, you want to get them back down so that we can get back to this YFE. It turns out that dropping interest rates, the central bank can do that overnight. So our FOMC, the Federal Reserve, is going to be meeting today and tomorrow. They could choose to drop interest rates like that, or at least short-term interest rates. But it takes about a year or two for that to actually lead to higher spending. Why? Because interest rates fall. It's not like I'm going out to buy a car tomorrow. Interest rates fall overnight. It's not like companies decide to all of a sudden start building more factories. It takes time for them to adjust their plans. So this adjustment process can take some time. And that's why in the meantime, we can have high unemployment in a recession. This is kind of the story of 2008. So we had a massive decline in spending. Then the central bank had to lower rates to try and get us to spend more, but it took us a long time to actually start spending more. So I heard a question about 2008 earlier. Does that kind of help clarify what was going on in 2008?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thanks, Marcin. Any questions on where we are so far? We're flying through macroeconomics, so slow me down if you need to. Either you're very shy or this is the most clarity that's ever been brought in a macroeconomics course in a half an hour. I'd like to think it's the latter. But something tells me that's not what's going on.
You're doing a great job.
Well, P-Stud, you're not the shy one, but
yes.
But I'd love to hear from those that I haven't heard from yet. All right, we'll carry on. There's going to be a quiz at the end of the hour. How about that? There won't be actually, but maybe that would get you guys to speak up if there were. We'll have to incorporate that next time. Okay, so this is 2008. Let's suppose instead, so we're back to our normal YFE line. Let's suppose that we all decide, you know what, we don't want to work 40 hours a week. Our preferred work week is 30 hours a week. Anyone ever felt like that? You're even willing to say that in front of your potential bosses. All right. They want some time off. How would we reflect that in this graph? In other words, how would we formulate? Let's all say that we decided it's not just we want time off next week. Going forward, we want a 30-hour work week. And let's say across the whole US, people said that. How would that be reflected here? Daniel?
Would the YFE have to move or shift and the inflation and unemployment range shift with it? I mean, if collectively, all else being equal, the group comes to consensus, everything would shift in the economy here?
That's exactly right. So our YFE line, our YFE line would be shifting down here. Now, if we leave interest rates at 1%, what do we expect to see in the economy? What sort of things would you observe? What would be your primary concern? We started this discussion with two big concerns. John, what do you think? What would you be worried about? You there, John Doyle?
Yeah, sorry about that. I was actually wondering how you differentiate people wanting to work 30 hours a week and then underemployment.
It's tough to differentiate. We're just doing a hypothetical right now. In the data, it's tough to look at that. There are labor force participation measures, but even then you have to interpret it with that sort of a question in mind. Right now, let's just say hypothetically, we know it's people decide they don't want to work 40 hours. They'd rather work 30, or we all want early retirement. Do we agree that would shift this YFE line in? We're just able to produce less because people aren't working as hard. So what do we expect to see? Are you worried about any of these big red, worrisome things here, Mark?
I guess at that point trying to figure out what the unemployment rate could look like. Because
unemployment's a bit ambiguous because we're choosing not to work as much.
Yeah.
There's something that we will definitely see, almost definitely.
I feel like high employment would go up. I mean, more people be working, they just be working less hours. I mean, Europe does this, right? I mean, Europe, their work week is a lot less than us. Their production level is a lot less than the US, right?
That's right. So let's say both people retire early and work fewer hours. There's going to be fewer people working as many hours. So YFE shifts in.
So
would we agree this is how much we can sustainably produce? Is this purple YFE? How much do we want to spend right now given interest rates? Matthew Baybrook, what do you think? Braybrook?
No, the comment I was going to make is that assuming that people work shorter hours, there's a drop in productivity. I think that's what Europe's trialing, because they're claiming that if you give people more time off, they're more productive at work, and if you don't drop their wages, then you can keep productivity and put more money into the economy.
Okay, so you're making a claim that YFE won't actually fall. We can all work 30-hour work weeks, but we'll be more productive. So YFE stays where it is.
Potentially,
I'm fine with that. I'm not going to take a stand on it, but let's assume YFE goes down. Let's say the only thing that changes is we have fewer workers and their productivity has stayed the same. So we have less potential GDP. So if potential GDP is at the purple line, how much do we want to spend if interest rates are 1%? Toral?
A lot. Yeah.
Sorry,
I think that. Oh,
Toral, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, I think that entire line shifts down as well. That slope shifts down as well.
Well, that might be nice for us, but it turns out we still have the same home prices. Our spending is still the same. It's just that we want to work fewer hours. So for this level of interest rates, our spending is still way up here.
Okay.
We're spending at this old YFE, but our new YFE is here. So if we're
We-
spending more than the economy can produce, what do we
We'd risk
expect to see?
inflation.
Adnan?
We risk inflation.
Inflation. That's exactly right. So if YFE shifts down, but we're still spending above it, then we risk inflation. We had heard earlier that, inflation zone gets a little bit bigger. So now we risk inflation. If you're the central bank, what do you need to do with interest rates? What does your mandate tell you you should do with interest rates?
Increase.
Increase them.
Right.
Okay, yeah, we want to increase rates. We want to bring rates up to, to be right above this purple YFE. So maybe to 1.5%. This is what would make spending consistent with YFE. Are we okay with that? The whole point of this discussion is to show that what the Federal Reserve is doing depends on the shock that's hitting the system. If the shock that hits the system reduces our potential supply, our potential capacity, or YFE, then they have to do one thing. If it reduces our desired spending, they have to do a whole nother thing. Does that make sense? Okay, that's macroeconomics in 40 minutes. Let's pause and take some questions. I'm not going to move on until I get at least one question. I see Mr. Malone's hand. I'm going to come back to Mr. Malone. I want to hear a question from someone I haven't heard from, and then I want to hear from Mr. Malone. All right, Mr. Malone, ask your question, then I'm still not going to proceed until I get another hand.
I was just curious about like the shock, is this shock like what is contributing to this factor to shock them to do something, to act? Is it, over what span of time? What are the indicators that might cause them to do this?
There's tons of them. So I think that you can reach out. What should have been circulated to you was kind of a history of the macroeconomy in the United States since 2008, and it covers a lot of those shocks. So I'll kind of refer you to that reading, and then hopefully this will give you a lens through which to understand that reading, and it'll give you a greater sense of the shocks that are kind of hitting the macroeconomy. I'd seen a hand that came up and went away. There we go, Kritika.
Hi, Dan. So I wanted to ask, why will the YFE line shift when the productivity will remain the same, irrespective of the hours coming down from 48 to 30 hours?
Because let's say you work on a farm and you're just as productive at picking apples, but now there's fewer people picking apples, or you do it fewer hours. You're going to have less apples. In other words, you can think about our productive capacity depending on how many workers you have and the hours they work, how many machines you have, and then productivity. If productivity stays the same, but any one of those other things falls, you're going to get less output. So you'll have fewer apples.
Right. Thank you.
Yep. Jamin.
So tariffs, would you consider that as a shock? And if so, how would it affect
I
our
love that
model?
question. Let's think about that. All right, so let's kind of erase all of our shocks so far and start back to where we were. All right, so let's say we're at our original YFE and everything's kind of nice. We're in our sweet spot. And then all of a sudden we live in a world with tariffs and also tariff uncertainty, because who knows what the heck tariffs are going to be. Is that a fair statement? Would you guys agree that that's a fair statement? There are many stories one could tell. This is what makes this so complicated. All I care about is that they're consistent with the framework. So start to tell a story like how tariffs might influence behavior, and then we'll think about how in the aggregate that might show up in this graph. So what might happen with tariffs? Just tell a story. Leos?
I think they could impact like global supply chains.
Okay. And so if they impact global supply chains, what's that gonna, how will that show up in the graph? What's the main thing that's gonna affect?
The theoretic line.
Say that again? I heard.
I'll raise my hand.
Okay, thank you. Helen, what do you think?
Line goods are going to get more expensive. So prices go up, inflation goes up.
Yeah, one way to think about it, when supply chains get affected, it's harder to produce stuff. We need those inputs in order to produce the stuff that we produce. If lumber prices go up, if we can't get access to lumber, then we can't build homes. I'm sure you can think of many other examples where you have intermediate imported inputs that you need to actually produce the stuff we produce in America. So we can think about YFE going in. And then conceptually, it's just like what we discussed with respect to people not wanting to work as many hours. YFE is shifting in. All else equal, that should be inflationary. And the central bank will probably have to respond by raising rates to prevent that inflation. Conceptually, that's a logical story. What else could happen? What's another story we could tell? We're going to take, another 5 minutes telling stories about tariffs, then we'll actually look at the data. And we'll do a quick overview of the data. Daniel?
Businesses could eat costs.
Greg, go for it. Was that Greg? Were you talking?
Yes, businesses could eat those costs to keep market share.
Yep. If they eat those costs and keep market share, at least within the short term, we're still at YFE and we're fine. We actually get some extra government revenues and we're in good shape. So one could say that if businesses eat those costs, stock prices should go down a bit because businesses are eating those costs and so their profits would go down. But you could say at least YFE would kind of stay where it is. So that's another story we could tell. What other stories could we tell?
In long term, it'll create a slowdown because of more expensive items will create a slower demand.
Okay, well, the long-term slowdown you could rationalize just by this YFE shifting in. If prices don't go up, I don't know if demand will fall if companies eat it. So that's true. Let's think about not just tariffs, but tariff policy uncertainty. What do you think, firms are doing right now when they think about building a new factory?
Hold off on investments.
Yeah, they're holding off on investments. So if all else equal, companies put capital expenditures on hold to see what's going to happen, how would we formalize that here?
Unemployment goes up, inflation goes up.
Why does inflation go up? Companies just decide they're not going to build any more factories. Those factories don't come online for another year or two, but they stopped hiring people to build them.
Because they have lower inventory, so they're going to try to front load their revenues by raising prices.
Ah, I see what you're saying. Okay, so that would be kind of the YFE shifting in, and on top of YFE shifting in, you're saying they're going to stop building new capital. Let's say the only thing that firms do, let's just do one thing at a time. The only thing firms do is stop building new factories. They have the capacity to meet current demand, but they were building factories to think about demand 2 years from now. They say we're going to stop. How would we formalize that here? Thesh, what do you think?
Since they stop, I guess, spending on new capital expenditures, we'd see the black line shift downwards.
You bet. Now all of a sudden, our spending line is shifting in. Because for any given level of interest rates, companies stop spending. Now, if we combine these, so let's say that's the only thing that happens. What do you want to do as the central bank? That's the only thing that happens in the economy is firms stop building new factories. You're in charge of the Federal Reserve. What do you want to do?
Lower interest rate.
Lower interest rates, yeah.
Adnan, is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, exactly.
Beautiful. Okay, so now we've told two very reasonable stories about how tariffs could affect the economy. One is they could shift in YFE, which would require the central bank to raise interest rates to fight inflation, or they could start to lower our spending, causing a recession and a high unemployment, which would require the central bank to lower rates. Are we okay with that? Depending on which of these effects dominates, the central bank might have to do one thing or another. Are there any questions about that? P-Stud?
I would say one of the bigger stories around a lot of that, though, is long term, 10 years from now, if we continue to have these tariffs, markets will go around the US and we won't be selling a lot of our stuff anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot of implicit assumptions behind that, but you could tell some very reasonable stories where that's true. Now, you could also tell a story where, look, firms ultimately want to sell to US consumers. It's going to be cheaper to do so if you build in the United States. And so you could tell a story where 10 years from now there's reshoring and we eventually get to a place where we have more production here. Some economists in Switzerland have run models of this to try and understand what the effects of the tariffs are. Loosely, what they would say, in about 10 years from now, this YFE is going to shift in by about 1% in the long term. But there's massive redistribution. Some people are going to benefit a lot and others are going to lose. The people that benefit a lot are those that are already working in manufacturing and those that work in textiles. And so some of the rationale for tariffs is basically to help people that, would support them based on the industries they work in right now. And so if you work in manufacturing, you work in tariffs, you're going to be a lot better off. There's a big debate over whether or not there are going to be more jobs in manufacturing. The manufacturing jobs of the future are likely to be highly automated. But if you already work in manufacturing, these tariffs will probably increase your income. For the rest of us, our incomes will be about 1% lower than they used to be.
I mean, how does that work? I mean, how do you get more things produced in America without prices going way up for all of our products?
Yeah, isn't they kind of assuming that the prices will stay the same if we build it here or do more stuff over time here?
More factories will be producing in the United States, but they'll be a lot less efficient. We'll be producing stuff we're less efficient at than we were. And so there's a reallocation toward things that we're less efficient at producing, and we're not going to produce as much of the stuff we're as efficient as. So we'll have more factories, but we'll have less of other stuff. And that's why this YFE line ultimately shifts in, because the YFE captures everything we produce. So we'll produce more of some things, manufacturing will produce more of, but we'll produce less of other things. And so on aggregate, we're generally producing less. David H?
Yes, what I don't understand is what that the U.S. economy has full employment. If you are trying to get firms to produce in the United States, wouldn't that? How would you get the people to produce whatever you're trying to get to produce in the United States? I mean, that's wouldn't that be able to?
Like, how do you get the workers to be willing to work in manufacturing?
Yeah, if most of the people are already working.
Can I add a nuance to David's question? How do you combine the tariffs? I guess how would you assess the combination of tariffs and restrictions to immigration?
I'm going to leave that as a question for you guys because that's adding another wrinkle on it. But conceptually, you should be able to think about restrictions on immigration, how that would show up here. We're going to leave that as like a homework assignment or something for you to ponder. Hopefully I've given you a framework where you guys feel confident being able to answer that question. Back to David's question, I think the idea behind tariffs is if you want to do more manufacturing in the United States,
yes,
then by imposing tariffs, manufacturing firms are more likely to locate here than they are abroad. Now, it's more expensive here. And so we're less efficient than, say, if they were in China because it's a lot cheaper to, the labor in China is much cheaper, it's so on and so forth. But once you have those manufacturing plants here, they're going to demand workers to work for them, and that'll raise wages in the manufacturing sector such that people will be willing to work those jobs. Now, we're going to have to pay more for that output that they produce. If you don't work in manufacturing, you're going to have to pay more for manufactured goods because it's more expensive to produce in the United States.
But I understand that there's a lack of people in the United States that are working there. What I mean is, where are you going to get the people from to work in those firms or in those factories?
So one argument would be that wages would go up enough to incite people to work there. Now we can think about whether we think that's realistic or not. But at least hypothetically or potentially wages in the manufacturing sector would rise such that would induce people to stay and continue to work there. But, G. Petrie's comment is true. Like, look, if you restrict immigration, all right, fine, I'll just give you the answer. That's like YFE shifting in even more.
Okay.
I mean, that's the whole point. I still don't understand how you do that without the pricing. I mean, in the early 80s, we went to China and helped them figure out manufacturing so that things would be cheaper for Americans. And if we start paying people for their labor in the US, then these products become exorbitantly expensive, or they just can't be done. No one buys these things.
Now, the average household kind of agrees with you, P-Stud, that this is a measure of inflation expectations, and they have skyrocketed recently for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
This darker blue line is from the survey of professional forecasters. It's increased recently, not as big of a spike, but still well above the Fed's target of 2%. And so we haven't seen it quite yet in the inflation figures, but there are reasons we might not have. So this is inflation. It's kind of stabilized, still above the target. But firms have been eating those costs. They've been drawing down on inventories. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 6 months. Capital expenditures too, like, if those start to decline, that will pull down inflation. Whereas at the same time, the restrictions on immigration and tariffs could push up inflation. So these two forces could be pulling in different directions. Jay Perez?
I'm muted finally. Here we go. I guess, I think one thing to add, I guess, to macroeconomic theory would be that in many ways, what tariffs are a way to get in the way of the Ricardian theory of specialization, right? Which is, I guess, the very essence of global trade, right? Which is, hey, if you specialize in this, we'll specialize in this, and then we'll trade off of each other. And that way we'll be better off because you're using all the resources that you got to be great at this, such as, just as a quick example, like China counts on tremendously mathematically far more labor than us. So it's a lot cheaper to find a large talent pool for doing manufacturing, even if it's at a basic level of skill, or if it's very advanced, they're going to have the number of people just because we just don't have the population. And then there are other factors that come into play, like education and stuff. But I think at the very basic, adding costs to trade ends the very essence of why we started to do this, which is, back in the day, David Ricardo thought it would be a good idea for, instead of countries fighting each other and conquering each other and, basically making everything happen because of conquest, that it wouldn't be a good idea to trade away. So this really is the main shock to it, is that it's the very first, no, not the very first, but in a long time, it seems like the very first antithesis to what we've always wanted to do, which is to trade with one another without obstacles. And
yeah, and
there's
a strong argument there, right? So we're kind of getting into, at the end of the day, when we think about tariffs, what I just want to convey to you are some potential effects and how to formalize them. But then, you guys as individuals have to step back and say, what are my values and what are my preferences? And how do I then map that on to what the different trade-offs are to decide whether you agree? So, Mr. Perez, a counter argument would be, for example, that comparative advantage can evolve over time. So even though I might not have a comparative advantage today in manufacturing, if I start doing more of it, then I'll start to get better. 10 years from now, maybe I'll be super efficient at it and I'll be amazing at it. And so then it's worth maybe restricting trade. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily my view, but that would be a counter argument. I have a lecture on this stuff that if you guys want to look at, you can reach out to the executive MBA team where I talk about this in more detail. Since we only have 5 minutes, it's a super interesting comment, and I want to dive into it more, but I think for the sake of time, I'll just kind of refer you guys to that lecture. Go ahead. One more thought, Mr. Perez.
The only question I had for you then, again, just alluding to what you mentioned just a few times throughout the lesson is, hey, did you guys read or did you guys go over a certain piece? Well, it's obvious, at least on my end, we didn't have any material prior to this very first lesson. So going forward, will we have some sort of kind of like a syllabus or sort of, reading material prior to it?
I think you should have had one for today, and we're just adjusting given that you didn't, but I think for the future sessions, I'm almost certain that you guys will.
That's cool. All
right. That was our fault on our end. We didn't get the material in time because we were rushing to set this webinar. So David said he would forward the information to us, and then we'll make the distribution this week.
Perfect.
And then going forward, there will be reading materials for additional webinars coming up. So
appreciate
my apologies. Thanks. Yep.
But actually, it might work out well the way it happened today, because we have the framework, and then if you go back to the materials that could have been sent out, that'll give you a way to interpret it and think about it.
This has been a great presentation. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks. We have 5 minutes left. Jamin, go for it.
Okay, so what about the deficit? I know we only had 3 minutes.
Yes. All right.
The deficit's going way up. End of story.
Solve the economy. Go.
Okay, so debt to GDP, where do I have it? Is going way up. Normally, if this were 2008, I wouldn't have been concerned about that. Why? Because interest rates were super low. That's a great time to borrow and build new infrastructure, which we really need. As long as you can make the interest payments, imagine if you were to buy a $5 million house, but the interest payment was negative. It's almost like they're paying you to buy the house. Then it's almost affordable. Whereas if you have a super high interest rate on a $200,000 house, that could actually be unaffordable. The big issue that we're running into today is that our interest payments are skyrocketing. Right now, they're about 3% of GDP, and that's projected to go up and up and up. So the double whammy is when you have high debt and you're paying really high interest on that. Interest rates are going up. Why? Because inflation has been high, YFE has been in, so the central bank has had to raise rates. We'll see what they do going forward, whether they think we're going to get a spending recession when firms stop spending, or the inflationary effect of tariffs is going to dominate. If the latter, our debt's going to become even more unsustainable. That's an issue because the way we pay back debt is to raise taxes. This is the first time, I think, in history, I mean, maybe not the first time in history, but it's very rare to see tariffs and exchange rates falling. And that's what's happening in the United States. This is average exchange rates. So the US dollar has been losing value. Usually when you impose tariffs, you tend to see the dollar gain value. Why? Because people try to buy goods from America rather than from abroad. In order to buy those goods from America, they need US dollars. So tariffs, all else equal, tend to push up the value of the dollar. Right now, people don't want to hold US assets. They don't want to hold the US treasuries. One reason might be because they're afraid we're not going to pay back that debt. And that's a pretty rare thing for the United States and scary thing. So if you'd have asked me 10 years ago about debt, Jamin, I would have said, I'm not too worried about it. Interest rates are low. If anything, we should buy more debt and invest in infrastructure. Today, the story's different. And we need actually probably to worry about our debt and the interest payments on those debt. And we're starting to see that in bond markets. We're starting to see it in foreign exchange markets. So that's like a 2-minute answer to that.
Or where do you think, when does he raise or cut interest rates at all this year?
You know, I think I wouldn't be surprised if they stay steady. And the reason is because any monetary policy decision that they make, it takes about a year for that to filter through the economy. So they have to forecast what's going to happen within the next year. And we don't know what trade policy is going to do. We are at an all-time high in trade policy uncertainty.
So I might win my bet.
This is a trade policy uncertainty index. No one knows what's going to happen. And so even if you knew the effects of tariffs, if you don't know what they're going to be, it's hard to figure out which of these two shifts is going to dominate. So think back to our discussion, YFE shifting in, or is it going to be that firms stop spending? Whichever one of those dominates will dictate whether you want to raise or lower interest rates. We don't know which one's going to dominate probably for any given tariff policy, and we don't even know tariff policy. So I think it's just, stick on hold for now would be my guess.
I have a bet that it won't be cut.
Yeah, that's
till
probably
the end of the year, but it's actually, I have it till only July, so I'm good. I think I'll win.
Yeah, and unemployment right now is not bad, so.
I know I'm gonna bring even more confusion to it, but I think for next lecture, talking about the money supply, which is a big problem in the US, right? How the government, how the Fed influence on what they do and they don't do with the money, with the big money supply, buying back
I'd love to, if we had more time, I'd love to discuss that. And I forget if I'm slated to see you guys at any point again in the future, but if I do, I'd love it, and we'd be able to talk about that, Marcin.
All right.
All right, thank you guys so much for this hour. Hopefully you have the beginnings of a framework to at least organize your thoughts about what's going on in the macroeconomy when you read about it in the news and try and interpret different policy decisions. Hopefully this is something that you guys can come back to. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank
Good job,
you, Dan.
Peter.
Thank you. I'll pass to John in just a moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
Pass to John in just a moment, but thanks y'all for bearing with us. Some hiccups this time, but really just great conversation, and that's what we're trying to engineer here. We'll make sure to get you the pre-reads for the next session, and we'll certainly close the loop on this one with the pre-reads and the lecture that Dan alluded to. So thanks all for your time. Appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.
See you then. Bye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.